Yay, hello everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Francesca D'Alessio, the Associate Educator for Public Programs here at the Met, and we are so delighted that you're here with us this afternoon. Thank you so much for coming. We have an opportunity through talks at the Met to take a closer look at the permanent collection and explore themes creating new connections and explorations. Today is our final program in the series Making History. You can find the previous 2 episodes posted on YouTube, and today's program will soon follow. So please look for us on the Met's YouTube channel. This series, Making History, explores the evolution of history painting. Today we will dive into how contemporary artists have reclaimed the past, reshaped our understanding of history, and responded in our world today. Before I tell you a bit about our speaker, I'd like to take a moment to thank Todd for his wonderful support throughout our entire series and for sharing his excellent graphic design skills with us. Yay, Todd, thank you for everything. Of course, I also need to thank my amazing colleague in education, Gabriel Mungo, for his incredible support always. Without him, our public programs would not happen, so thank you to Gabriel. So it's such an honor for me to talk about Catherine Callie Galitz. She's an art historian and educator here at the museum. She's an amazing colleague and friend and dear friend to so many of us. She received her PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. Kathy's a frequent lecturer and has taught at both NYU and Hunter College. She's also a fellow at the Art Institute of Chicago. At the Met, she served on our curatorial teams for international exhibitions and has published numerous works on neoclassical portraiture. She is also the author of the Metropolitan Museum of Art Masterpiece Paintings from 2016, How to Read Portraits from 2024, and the most recent, Manet, The Great Works from 2026. No pressure, but we're always excited to see what you have coming up next, Kathy. Kathy is highly distinguished here at the Met, and it is an honor to learn from her. Her esteemed scholarship and publications are unparalleled, and it is such a great pleasure for me to introduce her today. Please give a warm welcome to Catherine Callie Galitz.
I'm kind of embarrassed. I don't know if I can live up to that super generous introduction. Thank you, Fran. And I might be in trouble later with Todd, but I swear it wasn't my idea, so you've got to believe me. I want to thank you all for your support of this series and also for coming today on such a beautiful Sunday when you could have either gone to the beach, stayed home to watch World Cup, or gone to the Pride Parade. So thank you very much for being here today, for your support. And having just concluded a 3-part lecture on making history, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that history was also recently made, actually in San Antonio, Texas, but impacting all of us here in New York. So I would like to think that my talks inspired the team to go on to that thrilling victory, so you're welcome. So, all right, serious now. My last talk ended with the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963 and Andy Warhol's response in his series of silk-screened Jackies. In his appropriation of the press coverage of Kennedy's assassination, Warhol brought new currency to history painting in the age of mass media. At the same moment, in what was then West Germany, Gerhard Richter realized this painting of a newly sworn-in President Johnson comforting Kennedy's grieving widow. It was based on a newspaper photograph by Cecil Stoughton, which was published in a special issue of Berliner Illustriert in December 1963. Richter's small canvas is hand-painted, not silkscreened. Its inscribed title replicates the photograph's caption in the newspaper, explicitly linking the painting with its printed source. In another uncanny coincidence, Warhol's 35 Jackies is based on a nearly identical photograph also by Stoughton, this one capturing the moment that preceded Richter's image. So you see Richter is the one at the bottom, and Kennedy is drawing from the one at the top. And here they are together. Completely coincidental, capturing really the zeitgeist, but I love this comparison. At mid-century, modernism held sway. Its advocates extolled the formal qualities of a work of art over subject matter. What then did the dominance of abstraction, as embodied in Jackson Pollock's Autumn Rhythm from 1950, mean for history painting if critics had already proclaimed the demise of the genre like 100 years earlier in 1964 when Emanuel Leutze exhibited Washington Crossing the Delaware in New York City? The resurgence of figurative art in the 1980s contributed to a new interest in history painting among contemporary artists. In 1994, the artist Kerry James Marshall declared, quote, "I've always wanted to be a history painter on a grand scale like Giotto and Géricault." Contemporary artists like Marshall on the left and Kent Monkman have reclaimed past narratives or introduced hitherto untold histories, often from the perspective of those whom the tradition of history painting has excluded or marginalized. Alternatively, artists such as Nicole Eisenman and Henry Taylor are responding to contemporary events, painting history as it is happening. And that approach, as you may recall from my talk last month, emerged in late 18th century Europe, as we saw in the work of Jacques-Louis David during the revolutionary decade of the 1790s. And to my mind, this juxtaposition of David's death of Marat and Henry Taylor's death of Philando Castile, although separated by a couple of hundred years, really speak as images of contemporary martyrs, but for different reasons. And we'll talk about Taylor in a bit. The wide range of both artists and subject matter that we will explore today reveal that history painting is indeed alive and well. In the 1960s, Richter mined his family's photo album as source material for a series of painted photographs that reflect Germany's recent history. Rendered with what would become his signature blurred contours, his 1965 painting after a photograph of his uncle Rudi dressed in the uniform of the German Wehrmacht represents one of the first works in post-war German art to explicitly address the country's recent history. It also acknowledges his own family's complicity in that past. In 1988, Richter deployed the same technique in a cycle of 15 photo paintings, collectively known as 18 October 1977. The works are based on press and police photographs published in German magazines that document the history of the Baader-Meinhof Group, a radical left-wing organization that had waged a campaign of violence against the West German government since the 1960s. And that's the work on the right is one from that series. Painted 11 years after the events depicted, Richter's subject resurfaced recent trauma in the nation's collective memory. Richter reflected on the work's significance, quote, "The deaths of the terrorists and the related events both before and after stand for a horror that distressed me and has haunted me as unfinished business ever since." Richter's technique, that blurred imagery, literally denies a clear reading of his subject. The lack of formal clarity has been interpreted as signaling the artist's ambivalence toward his subject. That ambivalence, the lack of a moral stance, subverts the didactic function of history painting, which, as you will recall, since I've talked about its origins in the Renaissance, there was always supposed to be a moral lesson inherent in a history painting. And here it's been suggested there is none. Richter's history paintings variously explore the dark underbelly of German 20th century history. Similarly, as a Black artist working in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1970s, Robert Colescott forced contemporary audiences to confront the prevalence of racism in mainstream American culture by recasting iconic works of art with racial stereotypes. He adopted a cartoon-like aesthetic that underscores the satirical nature of his appropriated imagery. At the same time, he intended his works to serve as correctives to the narratives then propagated in textbooks of American history, which minimized or excluded the historical contributions of Black Americans like George Washington Carver, an agricultural scientist. This George Washington occupies the place of America's first future president in Colescott's 1970 parody of Leutze's 1851 Washington Crossing the Delaware, reproductions of which then and possibly still now proliferated in American textbooks. I just haven't looked at an American textbook in a little bit, just a little bit. Colescott subtitled his work, Page from an American History Textbook, just to drive home that point in case it wasn't already clear enough. In the 1980s, Colescott moved away from such old master appropriations in his series called Knowledge of the Past is the Key to the Future. And this 1986 work, which belongs to the Met, called Some Afterthoughts on Discovery, presents a critical view of European colonialist expansion. We see Christopher Columbus, the guy in purple on the right, navigating a ship at sea. He's flanked by the skeleton of the Viking Leif Erikson in an imagined time-defying voyage that evokes both European exploration and the transatlantic slave trade. Colescott debunked the myth of discovery by aligning it with its dual legacies of slavery and racism in America, as embodied in the figures of an enslaved laborer, whom you can see just to the left, carrying that huge bundle, and he is standing over the grave of a Native American. And alluding to more recent history, you see a Black man with a noose around his neck above them in the upper portion of the composition. Colescott's work also engages with the idealized depictions of Columbus as America's first founding father. And this narrative was first popularized in 19th century history painting. And as we all know, the history of Columbus remains a fraught and controversial one to this day. And here I think it's worth mentioning, in terms of this myth of Columbus, that before painting George Washington, the so-called father of our country, the German-born American artist Emanuel Leutze, in search of what he called American subjects for history painting, had seized upon the legend of Christopher Columbus. This is one of 7 canvases by Leutze, inspired by Washington Irving's romanticized account of Columbus's life and voyages, which had been published in 1826. Now here I confess that if you paid me before I started working on this lecture, I couldn't have named one other painting by Emanuel Leutze. Well, now I can, and this is one of them. So sorry Leutze. But I think this whole notion of this history and these narratives really have been perpetuated and largely through history painting. And that's what many of the artists that we'll look at today are really trying to debunk, these false narratives or false histories. A different Atlantic voyage informs the first series of history paintings by Kerry James Marshall, called Middle Passage. The series dates from 1991 to 1994. Its title refers to the forced voyage of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to the Americas from the 16th century into the 19th century. In this series, Marshall eschewed explicit definitions of the conditions on these slave ships and what he called, quote, costume dramas that locate the events in the past. Instead, Marshall fused past and present in works whose collage-like imagery evokes the fragmented nature of memory and disrupts the narrative clarity of history painting. The work on the left depicts a boat named Wanderer, and you can see its name inscribed on the prow. And that name is that of the last ship that transported humans as cargo, which landed on the shores of the United States in 1858, 50 years after the transatlantic slave trade had been outlawed. A skull directly below the prow and images of bleeding fetuses hanging from the mast allude to the many who died during the harrowing Middle Passage. The work on the right, Plunge, ostensibly a scene of middle-class suburban leisure, similarly triggers recollections of past traumas. And you can see just to the left of the diver, the Red Cross, which is a sign of imminent danger. The diver herself is poised on the edge of a pool, identified, and you can see on the lower left corner running vertically down the side, identified as the Atlantic Ocean. And to the right of that name, notice a directional compass, and below it, this little toy tugboat in which is navigating the waters of the Atlantic Ocean, sailing west. This then becomes an evocation of the Middle Passage, the slave ship sailing the Atlantic from Africa. So suddenly this woman's dive, which she is contemplating, suddenly appears fraught with danger. Marshall has said of the subject of the Middle Passage, quote, "You can't have such a monumental event hovering in the back of your mind and not deal with it in some way, either directly or indirectly." In a series of works begun in 2023, Marshall explores a different aspect of the transatlantic slave trade. In these works, Marshall borrows from the visual conventions of Western history painting to challenge the myths it perpetuates. Paintings such as Hall, painted in 2024, subvert the romanticized notion of Africa's glorious and royal past, as the British art historian and curator Mark Godfrey has discussed in the catalog of the current exhibition catalog, Kerry James Marshall, The Histories, which you can see now in Zurich and starting in the fall in Paris. Its composition conjures that of Washington crossing the Delaware, which, to my eyes, is a work that looms large in any discussion of contemporary American history painting. Whether you like Leutz's work or whether you hate it, and artists variously respond to it, but it is almost omnipresent in artists working in history painting today. Also, though, to my eyes, Leutz's work conjures this image, also at the Met: fur traders descending the Mississippi, a romanticized vision of frontier life painted in 1845 by the American artist George Caleb Bingham. To my eyes, the latter comparison is particularly apt, as Hall represents the history of the transatlantic slave trade, in which Europeans and Africans traded guns, rum, and other goods for human life. Marshall directly confronts this difficult subject in a work that has been posited as without precedence in contemporary art. Recalling Richter's still discomfiting images of 20th century German history, Marshall's work surfaces a dark time in Africa's history. Its lesson, arrived at by debunking the myth of an idealized African past, is that confronting our history will allow us to move on to a better future, as Godfrey argues in his analysis of Marshall's history paintings. And that notion of past and present colliding in these works, as we saw in Plunge. Here, if you look at some of the haul that the Africans are taking back to shore, you can see a couple of presents gift wrapped, which are very much something 21st century. And what is that random clock doing as well in the pile? All this is to remind us that we're connected to this past. It's part of the present as well. Marshall's ongoing expansion of the narratives of history painting resonates in the work of his contemporary, Kent Monkman, whose art focuses on the experience of indigenous people in dialogue with the tradition of history painting. Monkman, who is Cree, stated, "Our histories were erased from this canon of art history." His work imagines alternative histories of indigenous people, reframing history painting, and in so doing, staking a claim to its narrative power. Monkman subverts colonialist narratives in his monumental 2019 diptych, Wooden Boat People. The title is the Cree word for the European settlers who came to North America. Turning to focus on the panel on the left, welcoming the newcomers counters colonialist narratives of violence against European settlers enacted by indigenous people. Here, immigrants from different areas are welcomed and pulled to safety on the verdant shores of North America by the first peoples. However, the shark in the water, you can just make out its fin to the right of the standing figure, as well as the enslaved black man just below him, whose hands are shackled, portend the traumas of colonization. This historicizing subject is paired with resurgence of the boat people, whose composition riffs on that of Washington crossing the Delaware. See what I mean? Here, the place of the heroic general has been usurped by one Miss Chief Eagle Testicle, who is Monkman's time-traveling, gender-fluid alter ego. The name plays on mischief, mischief, and egotistical, eagle testicle. Mischief represents an agent of change in Monkman's work, here embodying the resilience of indigenous people, leading them forward in a reimagined future. Although one that's not without threats, in case if you look in the background. Notice how much the water has risen in the ocean since the time Washington crossed the Delaware, which is an acknowledgement of global warming and that threat. And then a more immediate threat, those men with guns in the background. Monkman's appropriation of Leutz's painting is characteristic of his work, which plays on such borrowings from Western art by recontextualizing his original sources, thereby investing them with new meaning. In this monumental diptych, which was commissioned by the Met, and you may remember seeing it hanging in the Great Hall in 2019, and I think the beginning of 2020, to be honest, I can't remember for obvious reasons. Monkman borrowed liberally from works in the Met's collection. For example, he transformed Delacroix's romanticized portrayal of a Natchez couple and their newborn who would not survive, as we know from Delacroix's 19th century literary source, to an image we see on the right of a happy, healthy family that counters 19th century notions of Native Americans as, quote, a dying race. Similarly, the seated figure at far left, with an eagle feather in his headdress, redresses the historically inaccurate portrayal of the indigenous leader who was popularized in Augustus St. Gaudens's 1874 sculpture, Hiawatha. That sculpture, in turn, is based on Longfellow's epic poem of the same name from 1855, which fueled the belief in America's manifest destiny, an expansionist policy that, among others, tragedies resulted in the forced displacement of indigenous peoples in the 19th century. Linking Monkman's vision of the past with this vision of the future, the family group based on Delacroix's painting reappears in this panel, this time as a same-sex couple with their child, while the enslaved man, you can see him just to the right, has become a doctor who's helping rescue someone from the threatening waters. Monkman's art historical appropriations subvert 19th century attitudes toward Native Americans as, quote, a dying race, that the original works perpetuate. As he explained, quote, with this project, I intercept that notion and refute it by acknowledging that our people are very much alive. Our cultures are thriving, and we're not frozen in time. I'm seeking to dismantle ideas that have been reinforced and perpetuated by museum culture. Speaking of that culture, like Monkman and Marshall, Titus Kaphar challenges the myths and omissions that the tradition of history painting perpetuates with works that Kaphar refers to as, quote, pictures more famous than the truth. And here a little bit, I think of Stephen Colbert's truthiness. Seems an apt comparison. Pictures like this 1851 painting of George Washington on his deathbed, one of a series of 5 history paintings by Junius Brutus Stearns depicting episodes from Washington's life that were occasioned by the 50th anniversary of his death in 1849. To Kaphar's point, the works in this series, like many history paintings, are idealized and far from historically accurate, but yet they're often read as documents of history, and also they are once again topical. Stearns's paintings appear in The Story of America, a series of videos produced by the White House to commemorate our sesquicentennial. And if you're interested, you can find them on YouTube. Shrouded in the background, in the shadows at far right, is Washington's enslaved valet, Christopher Shields, who was actively involved in Washington's daily life at Mount Vernon and among those present at Washington's death. But yet, if you looked at this painting, right, I mean, he's barely made it into the picture. That same man, Shields, also appears in Edward Savage's large-scale portrait of then-President George Washington and his family. But again, he is a background figure relegated to the margins of history, as it were. As Kaphar has observed, quote, we have so many pictures of Black people standing behind the main white characters, and in most cases, we know nothing about these individuals. Subverting such narratives, Kaphar realized this imagined portrait of Shields in 2025, using the full-length format that confers status in the tradition of elite portraiture in Western art. Shields' presence here commands our attention. He's the only subject. Kaphar centers someone who has been marginalized in history painting and by extension in history. Building on that notion, the graffiti-like application of white paint on this work and others in a series of works that Kaphar has done evokes the idea of whitewashing history. But yet, Kaphar seems to be saying, at least in my reading, that it's not possible anymore to whitewash this history. Similarly, in Kaphar's portrait of Ona Judge, another enslaved member of Washington's household, black tar deliberately obscures her face. This is the artist's rejoinder to the racist descriptor, tar baby. Just as her history has been overlooked, we are left to imagine what she herself looked like. And this work is currently on loan to the museum, and you can see it upstairs in the American Wing galleries. By asserting his subject's presence in our nation's history, Kafar challenges the myths of America's founding in the face of current attempts to perpetuate those myths in the name of patriotic history. Kafar refers to his works as amendments, since they represent revisions and additions to history rather than erasures, much like the amendments to our Constitution represent revisions and additions. In Kafar's words, these amendments are, quote, something that makes clear the distinction between where we once were and where we are right now. In this work, based on a 19th century image of a victorious General Washington at the Battle of Trenton, painted by the Scottish artist John Fade, Kafar amends the original portrayal of the heroic general on horseback to remind us that Washington was also an enslaver. The names of more than 300 enslaved people documented at Mount Vernon at the time of Washington's death, including that of Christopher Shields, appear on the canvas strips that almost entirely obscure the figure of Washington. Indeed, they almost seem to be suffocating him, and all that we see now are his nose and above. The strips are affixed with rusted nails to the canvas support, a reference to the 19th century power figures made by the Congo peoples in Africa, in which embedded nails and other sharp objects enforced communal codes of conduct, and in so doing, signaled resistance to European colonizing power. And if you're interested in Kafar's works and this topic, I encourage you to get to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts before the end of July, where you can see a selection of Kafar's works in dialogue with Stern's cycle of George Washington paintings, since 4 of those 5 works by Stearns belong to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and they've brought those works in a very provocative and timely dialogue. Like Kafar, the Los Angeles-based artist Henry Taylor addresses subjects that the tradition of history painting has excluded, using the language of portraiture to address the broader narrative of racial injustice in America. In this imagined scene of Martin Luther King Jr. playing backyard ball with a group of young boys, the arc of the football has been seen as alluding to King's celebrated quote in relation to the civil rights movement. Quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And just as we saw that unsettling image in the background of Monkman's, one of the panels in his diptych, Wooden Boat People, you can see a trio of white men hovering somewhat ominously in the background, as if perhaps to portend things to come. This work figures among his portraits commemorating Black athletes and other public figures from earlier generations that reclaim their histories and, in so doing, expand the historical narrative. In his art, Taylor moves fluidly from past to present histories. In 2016, Philando Castile, a 32-year-old Black man, was shot 7 times at close range by a Minneapolis police officer during a traffic stop. His partner and her 4-year-old daughter were also in the car. His partner live-streamed the shooting to Facebook. The following year, Taylor, who has painted other victims of police shootings, realized this work in response. And I'm quoting Taylor, "I wasn't trying to document every killing, but every once in a while I can't help but react or respond. It's not always emotional, but then you play the video and it's like, wow, wow, wow." In this work, Taylor bears witness to the tragic history of police killings in the United States. And he titled the painting, quote, "The times they ain't a-changing fast enough," riffing on the title of a Bob Dylan song. And you may remember this work was in the 2017 Whitney Biennial. Eric Fischel's painted narratives have explored issues of race and class since the early 1980s. His 1983 diptych juxtaposes a dramatic image of Haitian refugees landing on the South Florida coast, based on a contemporary photograph, and that's paired with a scene of a family vacationing. The early 1980s witnessed a dramatic rise in the number of Haitian refugees undertaking a perilous sea voyage in unsafe conditions, seeking freedom from political repression and poverty in Haiti. And this image this week once again became topical. These seemingly disparate scenes share the same coastline, and the sunbathing woman's left leg morphs into the truncated lower left leg of one of the refugees. Fischel's juxtaposition underscores contemporary social inequities based on race and economic privilege, and in so doing, implicates the white upper middle class family in its apparent oblivion to the suffering of the Haitians. The work's political charge evokes an iconic image of refugees at sea. The raft of the Medusa, which Théodore Géricault realized in response to the 1816 shipwreck of the French naval ship, the Medusa, off the coast of Africa. In this shipwreck, some 150 people were abandoned by the ship's captain at sea on a makeshift raft for nearly 2 weeks, and only 15 survived. And you can just see in the background the tiny, tiny sails of the rescue ship, the British ship Argus, coming to save them. Subsequently, the French government under Louis XVIII was accused of attempting a cover-up of the captain's incompetence that led to the disaster. And this event was a scandal in France. It was written up in the press. 2 of the survivors published a book about their experience at sea, detailing its horrors, which included killing the survivors, killing the weakest among them, and then cannibalism. It was horrible, to say the least. Géricault's work subverted the ideals of history painting, both in its contemporary subject and in its implicit critique of authority. Fischel has called Géricault's monumental canvas, quote, one of the all-time great paintings, the hopelessness, the drama, trying to stay alive against all odds is fantastic, and that's our tragedy. Fischel's 2016 diptych, Rift Raft, reprises the conceit of juxtaposing 2 different views of the world as a form of social commentary, this time painted in response to recent immigration crises in Europe. The raft of the Medusa again looms large in the panel on the right as refugees struggle to make it safely to shore, while in the other, a group of art world types remain disconnected from that reality, self-absorbed to the point of utter apathy. And interestingly, critics and people who've written about Fischel's works, this is the one where they invoke the raft of the Medusa, but to my mind, the 1983 work, it's a much more pointed and powerful both social critique and reference to Géricault's earlier painting. This work belongs to a series begun by Fischel during the 2016 presidential campaign. While the image is in keeping with the scenes of dysfunctional suburban families for which the artist is known, its title, Late America, and the prominence of the American flag towel on the child invite a reading of the work as something more than a slice of everyday American life. Fischel has commented, quote, "Sometimes I feel like America is a family gone rogue." To read Late America as a commentary on the state of the country in 2016 suggests that all is not well with this family. The isolation of the child from his father, the father's apparent indifference, and by the way, the dad should put on some sunscreen, that's another story, does not bode well for the future. Indeed, its sequel, Late America 2, painted in 2020, the sky is a foreboding blue-black, and the American flag towel returns, this time serving as a protective wrap around a mother and child. The latent anxiety in the poolside scene has given way to a sense of imminent danger for both mother and child and for the country. Now, it's dated 2020, and it's also painted with acrylic. And Fischl began using acrylic in 2020 during the COVID pandemic. So it's possible, although I don't know with certainty, that he painted this work at the onset of COVID. In a post-9/11 world, artists have turned to history painting in response to an increasing sense of chaos and instability. In 2014, Robert Longo realized this monumental charcoal drawing inspired by Guernica, which Picasso painted in 1937 as an immediate and visceral response to the horrors of the Spanish Civil War. And recall that Picasso in his work was also informed by contemporary press accounts of the events in Spain, because at the time he was in self-imposed exile in Paris. The dark charcoal bars obscuring and interrupting Picasso's image have been variously interpreted as frames of a film still, bars of a prison cell, and passages of redacted text. Longo's Guernica Redacted became a prelude to his own engagement with contemporary events. The murder of an unarmed black teenager by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri on August 8, 2014, and the protests that followed galvanized Longo to portray the present. That same year, he realized this monumental charcoal drawing of police officers in riot gear advancing toward unseen protesters, of which we occupy as viewers that position, in the streets of downtown Ferguson. The hyper-realistic image is a composite of several contemporary newspaper photographs that the artist altered. Its dramatic contrast of light and dark, as well as the lineup of armed officers, recall Goya's 3rd of May, 1808, another nocturnal image of violence against civilians, and a work that has served as a touchstone for Longo. In 2024, Longo realized a large-scale charcoal after Goya's iconic work, and he said that he did it in response to the war in Gaza. Longo's Ferguson drawing launched a series of charcoal drawings known as the Destroyer Cycle. Longo has said, quote, "Since the drawing of Ferguson, the work has just gotten much more overtly dealing with an engagement of the presence. I feel this moral imperative to deal with these phantom images that come at us every day." The works in this series chronicle the first Trump presidency and variously engage with power and authority, depicting civilian protests like the 2017 Women's March at Left, as well as the 2021 insurrection at the Capitol. In the latter, Longo slightly altered his photographic source to emphasize what he described as its performative quality, and I quote, "The protagonist stands draped in an American flag, posturing as a cinematic superhero or a classical Greek statue while being recorded on an iPhone, visible in the right of the composition." I think you can all see that disembodied hand filming what's going on. In 2017, a series of articles in Time magazine documented the ongoing immigration crisis in Europe, in which thousands of refugees and migrants from Libya were dying at sea en route to Europe. And in this article, 2017 was predicted to be the deadliest year yet. A photograph of the rescue of a group of some 180 refugees off the coast of Libya that summer inspired Longo's 2018 charcoal. However, Longo's drawing departs from its photographic source in its dark, cloud-filled sky. It was a bright blue day when the event actually transpired, and also in the placement of the overcrowded wooden boat at the crest of the churning waves of the Mediterranean Sea. Longo's alterations underscore the perilous plight of the refugees in an image that reads as a raft of Medusa for our times. Like Géricault's iconic history painting, Longo's Destroyer cycle subverts the traditional narratives of history painting, which have glorified authority since the genre rose to preeminence in 17th century Europe, a testament to the power of kings and emperors. And just as a refresh of where we began in this series, I reference works like Charles Lebrun's painting of the life of Alexander the Great, intended to flatter the French king Louis XIV, who modeled himself after the Hellenistic general Alexander the Great. Or, a couple of centuries later, Baron Gros's idealized portrayal of Napoleon as Christ-like in his benevolence towards the enemy. In contrast, Longo's representations of contemporary history reflect his intent to, quote, rip chunks of images of the world and put them in front of people, ask them what they think about it, ask people to take a stance. The tumultuous events of 2020 galvanized Brooklyn-based artist Nicole Eisenman, who realized this history painting in the aftermath of Occupy City Hall, a month-long encampment in the summer of 2020 at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, which took place in City Hall Park in downtown Manhattan. And in the upper left, you can just make out the corner of Tweed Courthouse. Eisenman was among those at City Hall who protested the murder of George Floyd, a black man killed by white police officer in Minneapolis on May 25th, 2020. His killing launched the global Black Lives Matter protest movement. The work's title, The Abolitionists in the Park, aligns past and present histories by linking Black Lives Matter to the 19th century abolitionist movement. And by the way, this painting is also in the Met's collection. The painting itself recalls the immediacy of Manet's response to the execution of Emperor Maximilian in 1867, as we talked about in my last talk, and also, as we saw today, Henry Taylor's visceral reaction to the shooting of Philando Castile in 2016. Among the diverse group of some 30 figures packed into this scene are portraits of the artist's friends, as well as Eisenman, who appears twice on the margins of the scene, as if to underscore their role as witness to the event that they depict. Eisenman's work lands us in the here and now, reflecting contemporary artists' engagement with the events of our own time. It recalls the French poet Charles Baudelaire's 1863 call to artists to paint, quote, the heroism of modern life. History painting today has come a long way since Leutz's retrospective glorification of Washington's revolutionary river crossing in 1776. Artists such as Kent Monkman, Titus Kaphar, and Kerry James Marshall are reframing and expanding its narratives. Their expansive vision of history resonates now more than ever on the eve of the 250th anniversary of the founding of our democracy. History is theirs to paint, and it's ours to reflect upon for a better understanding of our present and for charting our future. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful. Thank you. Thank you so much for your support. It really is a privilege and an honor to have this stage and to have this opportunity here at the Met to share my knowledge with you and to discuss these ideas. If you had asked little me growing up in central Pennsylvania if I ever thought I would have the opportunity to do something like this, I would not ever have believed you. So it really is a privilege, and I couldn't be more grateful for your support, and thank you very, very much. Thank you.